Thank you very much for having me. I was very happy to receive this invite to talk to you about multiverse analysis. I'm a postdoc at the Lab for Psychological Methods and Statistics in the University of Oldenburg in Germany. And over the last 3 to 4 years, I've really become engaged in the multiverse analysis literature. And the paper I'd like to talk to you today is a methods paper from a whole multi-lab collaborative multiverse analysis project that I was part of. And yeah, so we'll get started. Thank you for having me. So, okay, we'll begin with taking a look at what is multiverse analysis, in case you haven't heard of the term before. So it relies on this assumption that there's more than one defensible way to answer a research question. So in this example here, from raw data to final result, but this can also be study conceptualization too. But from the very beginning to the end result that you publish in your paper, researchers are faced with many different options across multiple steps of this process. And this is what has been termed researcher degrees of freedom. So it's basically an acknowledgement that we have this undisclosed flexibility in the way we handle our data. An example might be if in your study you include a questionnaire that assesses personality, and then you may decide that you might want to screen for carelessness in responding, or you may decide that you don't want to. And if you do, then you may decide, okay, well, I'll include some attention check items, or you may decide, oh, I'll base it off response time. So if people respond too quickly, then perhaps it's not plausible that they read the question correctly and considered the answer. And if you go with the latter, then are you going to, a priori define this threshold? Or will you base it upon a sample metric, so the mean or median response times of a sample, or the mean and median response times of that person across the battery of questionnaires that you might provide them? So a lot of these alternative ways that you can deal with carelessness in responses to a questionnaire may be deemed defensible, but they may also change the final data that you then analyze or that you want to test your effect on. So this idea of a multiverse analysis is that if we navigate this, what's been termed garden of forking paths. So if we get to a step and we say, I'm not just going to follow one defensible route, instead I'm going to follow 2 or 3 or however many you believe to be equally plausible, then this results in a whole multiverse of data sets at the end rather than just one. A multiverse analysis it involves identifying all of these defensible alternative decisions along the way. It involves computing the multiple data sets that they create, so running every single pipeline that you've identified, and then testing your research question across this whole multiverse of data sets. So yeah, in this visualization here on the right, this is taken from just a pilot EEG multiverse that we're running at the moment in our lab, but you can see here we have 4 different steps that we've decided to explore alternative options for, and just this small multiverse is giving us 352 different data sets at the end, so 352 different effect sizes. And in a traditional approach, then I guess you would only follow one of these pipelines. So yeah, this is in general what multiverse analysis is. This is the approach. So you might ask, well, why would I do all of this extra work? Well, because since we've found that in psychology and other fields of science too, we've kind of been hit by the revelation that maybe our findings don't replicate so well. And so researchers have been given many recommendations about how they can alleviate this issue of low replicability. And they center around mostly increasing the transparency of what we do, increasing the transparency of the data we're working with and exactly what we do to this data to reach our final effect. And you can see here in the visualization on the right, if a researcher was to only follow one pipeline, then they may get this red result here, which is a non-significant finding. Don't want to think that this happens, but a researcher could think, oh, maybe I did something wrong because this effect has been shown in previous literature. So let me go back and change what I did at this previous step and see, does this give me a significant result now? Does it not? Whether or not that occurs, even if only one pipeline is followed and reported, then there's less transparency then. And also it makes it easier to sometimes miss out some of what we do to the data when we're typing up our methods and results sections in our papers. Perhaps sometimes some detail is also missed. So it adds transparency to the results. And it also provides a robustness check. And in doing so, it can give us a nuanced understanding of the data that we have and the result that we're looking for, because we can then have a look across all of the different effect sizes that we get, and we can consider them in terms of the specifications that led to those effect sizes. So maybe we'll see some patterns, maybe there's one thing that you do to the data that tends to give you a larger effect size than if you didn't apply this specification to the data. And so doing so, I think it allows you to see then which decisions that your effect may hinge on. And so it could give us a more comprehensive overview of what the effect is a result of. And then, a couple of other nice benefits, I think, of multiverse analysis is that it can aid in providing detailed pre-registration because it will require the researcher to, well, depending how big your multiverse is that you plan to do, but if it's from, for example, raw data to final result, then it can aid the researcher to consider every single step along this data handling pipeline and pre-register exactly what they intend to do at every single step. So it could be more comprehensive, or I guess it encourages people to be more comprehensive if otherwise maybe they hadn't thought about including one of these steps in their pre-registration. And something really cool, I think, is that it encourages technological advancements. So how are we going to find ways, if we have these huge, large multiverse analyses to run, how are we going to find a way for our software to run these in parallel, for example, to save time? Or how can we come up with a method to inferentially analyze all of these different effect sizes into one result that we report? So it's really encouraging, I think, developments in this area too. But it's definitely worth pointing out that what it doesn't give us is the ground truth. So the idea is that all of these different decisions that we include are all defensible. So with that being the case, there's no one correct pipeline or one correct way to handle the data. There's no one correct data set at the end out of the multiverse of data sets. So we can say, okay, if you want to stick with descriptives, you can say, okay, 60%, 70% of the resulting effect sizes were reached statistical significance. However, you can't say whether this was, what the ground truth is. You just, I guess, reporting across all of these different data multiverses. And there are two key considerations that are currently receiving a lot of attention in the multiverse literature at the moment. The first is, how do we define the multiverse? So how big or small should our multiverse be? Where do we find these potential alternative defensible decisions for each step of the procedure? And how do we define defensible? And then the second issue that's receiving a lot of attention is, how do we inferentially analyze the multiverse? So the majority of precedent in the literature of multiverse analyses take a descriptive approach, because I think we're not so sure yet how to correctly take an inferential approach to all of these effect sizes. I know there was a preprint that was published recently, and I think this is interesting too. And I think there was a specification curve analysis paper also makes a suggestion for inferential analysis. But this is still something that researchers are still thinking about. So at the moment, the precedence mainly is for descriptive approach. But what I would like to talk about mostly today, which is in line with the paper that I will talk about, is how we actually define the multiverse, or where do we start? And I'll go through 4 different examples first before I get to the paper about how you might identify these alternative decisions. And one way is through literature review, and this is taken by the Meteor project, which is currently ongoing, and they've just conducted a systematic literature review. And you can focus this on your variables or components of interest, which I think is nice, because sometimes a decision may not be defensible outside of the component that you're looking at. And it also, because they've been published, then it's also peer-reviewed decisions that you're sampling from the literature review. And this, this visualization here is taken from the Shiny app from the project, where they openly share the literature review and the results. Another way to do this, so you'll notice that they all kind of involve crowdsourcing experts, basically. So you can either do this more passively through a literature review, you can do this more actively with crowdsourcing via a survey. This is also something done by the Meteor project, which actually combined the two approaches. They conducted a literature review to identify all different ways that experts in the field have analyzed their data, how they pre-process their data, and then they provide these as a drop-down list to experts and say, okay, here is a plausible research question, and this is the data set that you would hypothetically have. Please, using this drop-down list, construct your own pipeline to answer the research question. And I think what's expected is that not only will the decisions differ each step along the pipeline, but we'll find that some experts will decide to include a step in the pipeline, whereas others will decide it's not necessary and they won't do this. Also, the order of the steps that are applied along the pipeline could also differ. So this is just a way of defining the multiverse based on crowdsourcing the experts. Another approach, which is being taken by the EEG Many Pipelines project, is also crowdsourcing, but it's more of an active crowdsourcing. So they've actually provided teams of researchers with the data set and given them the research question and said, okay, analyze the data set yourself to answer the research question. And then they've collected all of the pipelines that were applied, all of the analysis scripts and the final results. So this is, I guess, a more hands-on way of not only defining the multiverse, but also collecting all of the, having the analysis run for you and then collecting all of the effect sizes. And this is, the researchers are actually looking at the data set and making a decision. And then the fourth example is the one that I'll speak to you about today, and this is called cooperative forking paths analysis. And this is slightly different to the other methods in that this involves getting a team of experts together to collaborate from start to finish. So from the conceptualization of the study all the way through to the final report of the multiverse. So it's very much a product of consensus rather than these experts working individually or within their own labs and then providing their effect size and their pipeline. Instead, everybody works together to say, I do or do not agree that this is defensible. So it's kind of like a peer-reviewed multiverse, I guess, from start to finish. And this is, what I'll talk about today. But just before I do, I just want to mention something which is also another methodological decision to define the multiverse, and that's how do you decide which of these alternative decisions are equally defensible. And this is covered with some really nice and clear guidelines in this paper, A Traveler's Guide to the Multiverse. And they point out that the aim of a multiverse is to obtain less biased estimates of an effect. And if we were to include decisions that are less defensible or less justifiable than others in our multiverse, then each time we include a specification that's less justified, this then has following forking paths coming from it. And instead you can have many then data sets in your multiverse that are a product of a less justifiable decision much earlier on in the pipeline. And therefore you might drown the reasonable effect estimates in what they say is a sea of unjustified alternatives. So they're really arguing for the case that you should consider whether a decision is, or multiple decisions are arbitrary. So are they equally defensible, or can you really say one is more justified than the other, in which case it might not be appropriate for your multiverse. So they quickly, because I want to get onto the paper, they give 3 examples of different domains of non-equivalence, and this can be measurement non-equivalence. So you can have single or multiple indicators of a measure, each bringing its own error, so it's each an imperfect measurement. And if you decide to include all these various different measurements for one concept, then they come each with their own validity and reliability, and they say therefore the resulting multiverse from this is non-equivalent across these. And that's one example. And then they say there's also an effect non-equivalent. So for example, if you decide to include covariates and not include covariates, then you're not actually testing the same thing. The effect that you're measuring isn't the same. It's no longer statistically equivalent. And they say instead this should be this is a theoretical matter that should be decided beforehand. And then a third example is power precision non-equivalence. So they say one thing that you might decide to fork in your multiverse is how you deal with outliers, the criteria for data exclusion. And this can lead to variation in sample sizes in the final data sets, the multiverse of data sets. And therefore this provides an imbalance of power across the effects. So yeah, they say these are 3 different domains you should consider for non-equivalence, and then you should be able to consider them as for whether they have principled equivalence, so whether these alternative specifications can be considered equally defensible, equally justifiable, whether they're non-equivalent, so whether you can identify based on these domains, and they also say there are other domains, not only these 3. If some are less justified, then perhaps we should exclude them from the multiverse depending on your aim. And we should also state whether or not we're uncertain or whether or not these alternative specifications are equivalent or not. So yeah, I mean, this doesn't mean that you should always exclude options, I think, that are non-equivalent, because I mean, if you want to test, is my effect robust across all of these defensible alternatives, then it makes sense. But if you want to explore and you want to say, okay, under which circumstances does an effect replicate, then you may want to be more exploratory and more inclusive with the multiverse. So it's always worth considering the aim, I think. Okay, so now I'll get onto the paper. So this is the co-science project, and this is following the cooperative forking paths analysis example. So where you have a team of researchers from multiple labs, and they work together to conceptualize the project, define the multiverse, they collect data together, each in their own labs, and put it together for one large data set, and then work together on the resulting manuscripts. So it's more of a consensus approach to the multiverse. And this is the paper. It's a methods paper based on how we kind of went about running this project and defining the multiverse. And it's available open access if you're interested in looking in more details. And something nice is with this journal, they include open reviews, and I thought that was relevant to mention. So yes, we'll start with step 1, internally peer-reviewed hypothesis and design. So what happened was all of the different labs contributed at least one hypothesis that they wanted to test. And then we all sat down together and we peer-reviewed each other's hypotheses, and we did this on an online forum, which is the coscience.net. And then we also sat down together in person and discussed, okay, so this design, you know, what's needed, which task, which order should we present the tasks to the participants? How will we go about all of these questionnaires that we want to give them now? You know, what's the best way to go about this? And then we all reached a consensus, and then pre-registered. And we all kind of peer-reviewed as well the pre-registrations, and yeah, the maybe not so relevant, but just to mention the research design that we came up with. The procedure is that the participants first completed the questionnaires online, and then they came to the lab and took part in an EEG study where we measured neural responses to a variety of different tasks. And we also measured ECG, and those who wished or agreed to gave a saliva sample. So the multi-laboratory data collection, these are the 10 different universities, or 9 different universities. There were 2 labs in Hamburg, one of which was the coordination lab, who took part in the data collection. And if you were to follow this approach for a multiverse, then there's obviously a lot of inter-lab standardization that you would have to take care of. So for example, we provided all labs with the same monitor from which to present their stimuli to the participants. We provided the same response box for them to answer to, and the whole setup really of that room was standardized as much as possible. All of the tasks were programmed on PsychoPy, and each lab installed the same version of PsychoPy, and all tasks were run through a batch file. But then on top of that, we also provided research assistant training, so a manual, and also meeting with them and talking them through the process, and observing them and supervising them for some pilot studies, some pilot data collection sessions to make sure that the what they're telling the participants is standardized. The emails that they send to the participants are also standardized. The order in which everything is done is also standardized, and the way they look for how the data is looking on the EEG, for to make sure that they're actually collecting a decent signal from the participants and not just noise. This is also training that they all received. I mean, it's never identical, but as closely as possible. But of course, you have to acknowledge that the environment of the lab is still different. So it could be the temperature of the lab, which we recorded, but also the research assistants themselves, how they interact with the participants would differ. So we wanted to make sure that we collected enough data so that we could look at inter-lab variance as well in the analysis. Okay, and now we'll get on to how we define the multiverse. So we had to reach a consensus on lots and lots of different steps along the analysis pipeline. So for EEG data, where we wanted to look at specific neural activation, there's a lot of steps to apply to the data to take it from the raw data that we record, remove all of the noise, while preserving as much of the signal as interest as possible. And as you know now, each of the labs had their own hypothesis, and this provided many different EEG components that people were interested in. So one person may be interested in one component, and then another lab will say, okay, well, I want to measure this component, and the same quantification parameters shouldn't be applied to both. So what's defensible for one will not be what's defensible for another. So we had a lot of decisions to make, and this took I think it was 3 days of us all getting together and going through each step one after the other, and we followed a procedure for each. And this picture here on the left is just an example of the records that we kept. So this is for a low pass filter. This is just one of the pre-processing steps. And what we did was, first of all, we would collect decisions. So from the literature, we all would read up in advance, and people were experts in EEG personality, neuroscience, and also member expertise, so what they've read and what they believe to be appropriate. And then we discuss the key considerations. So we would say, okay, in this instance here, we decided that maybe it's not defensible just to include lots of different filters. So perhaps if you had a high pass filter of 30 and another of 40, then maybe it's not defensible to include 31, 32, 33, 34, and so on, because then this is just going to, this will be doing what we were warned against by just exploding our multiverse, and then maybe our effects will get lost in what's didn't need to be included in the multiverse in the first place, because each decision is then forked for all of the further decisions, so it can have a huge effect on the number of multiverse data sets that we end up with at the end. And then once we discussed key considerations, we then reached a consensus on what we decided was and wasn't defensible. So here are some the rows that are in grey are decisions that we thought about but decided were not defensible. The ones left in white were the ones that we decided, okay, they're defensible and should be included in the multiverse analysis. But then as a final step, we voted on what would be preferred, and the winning option would become our preferred path. So this is also different from the older multiverse analyses, because we're kind of already placing, not statistically, we're not placing more emphasis on one step than the other, but for when we're reporting the results, we would say, okay, as a team of researchers, together we would have run this one pipeline, and then we will give the full multiverse results afterwards. So we give our preferred, and then we give the multiverse of defensible options afterwards. So it's, yeah, I guess interesting to know how the pipeline that 10 labs who are into this field deemed most defensible, because even if some labs wouldn't vote for a decision, then we would discuss it until people agreed, okay, I'm happy with this. So it's interesting to see where this would sit in the multiverse of outcomes. And yeah, this is kind of then an example of what we would have. So you have here a different step in the multiverse, and if it's grey, then considered but deemed not defensible. If it's green, we considered it not only defensible but the preferred option, and then blue are the defensible options that we would then explore in a multiverse. So we covered data pre-processing, data quantification, and also data analysis. And then we found that we actually had quadrillions of pipelines, and we weren't so sure what to do then, or whether this is a good thing or not. But then, yeah, we kind of revisited what we did, and we said, you know, we think we've thrown out all of the what's not defensible or what's less justified. We think that we already excluded this. You know, maybe it makes sense because there are so many steps. You know, we didn't only do this for the EEG components, but we also did this for, you know, the behavioral data, the personality data, all within one big multiverse, forking paths, I guess. So it makes sense that we have a lot. So what we decided to do is take a stratified random sample from the multiverse where, yeah, each specification is definitely included within the multiverse. Yeah, so the analysis is currently ongoing. It's an ongoing process. And what we will do is have this fully automated from start to finish. So hopefully it's reproducible for other researchers if they would like to run the scripts themselves. But yeah, I just thought it's worth mentioning just now at the end is that there are many different ways then to present the data at the end. And this image here on the left was taken from a recent conference that my colleague Daniel Cristanto presented, and it was inspired by a paper by Hall et al. And I just think it's a nice representation, just if you wanted to look into it, of various ways that you can present the multiverse at the end. And yeah, for our papers, we will provide a link to an interactive specification curve. So here at the top, you see you can plot all of the different effect sizes across the multiverse, and then you can color code them for whether or not they reach statistical significance. And then underneath, you can then plot all of the different specifications that contributed to each of the effect sizes on the top. So this follows like a vertical logic. So you have the effect size, and then all of the specifications that are that are colored in or that are noted underneath it are the decisions that contributed. So you may see that perhaps there's a certain choice in one step that's all huddled towards one size that tends to produce a lower effect size than when that's not selected. And yeah, we know so far that we will include this interactive specification curve so that researchers can instead, like, just instead of looking at this, because this can be so much information to try and make sense of, they can instead yeah, actively remove or add the specifications that they're interested in, and yeah, play around with it themselves. So this is also something, I guess, to consider with multiverse analysis, especially when you have so many different yeah, pipelines. It's when they're really large, then we have to think about how we visualize this in a way that makes sense for the readers. Yeah, and that's the end. And I've just noted here all of the people involved in the paper, all of the co-science people. And if you're interested in multiverse analysis and it's new to you and you're thinking that this is, yeah, you're not so sure and this is a lot, don't panic, or only panic a little bit, because there's lots of guidance out there, I think, for people who are new to this, and it's just increasing all of the time. I think as more and more people are getting involved in this type of analysis, then the more papers we're seeing, the more recommendations that we're receiving, and I think it's a supportive community. Yeah, that's it. And obviously, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.